The Geological Society of America puts on a lot of conferences every year, their National Connects meeting, and all of their sectional meetings. And at each one of these conferences, attendees have the opportunity to join amazing field trips led by local experts, either before and or after the conference. I just recently attended the Southeastern Section GSA meeting in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where I got to go on one of these field trips. And I wanted to film the experience for you all. And so what I did was film as much clips as I could from the field, which I'll show in this video, but I also went ahead and got to sit down to do an interview with some of the trip leaders. And so much of this video is the interview format to provide a lot of background about the rocks that you'll be seeing in the field clips that I was able to get. So without further ado, let's get into this field trip.
My name is Chuck Verstraeten. I'm a geologist from the New York State Museum and Geological Survey. I work on mainly various Devonian things from the events from the Devonian period.
Okay.
I'm Dennis Terry, Associate Professor within the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at Temple University. My primary research interest is the study of ancient terrestrial environments through the study of paleosols or fossilized soils.
Very
I work
cool.
in the Devonian with Chuck and also in the Cenozoic of the Great Plains.
So we are here at the Southeastern GSA, or Geological Society of America conference, the sectional conference, and you guys are going to be co-hosting a field trip after the conference, the day after the conference, that is titled Exploring the Catskill Clastic Wedge in West Virginia, Transitions in Life, Environment, and Climate of the Devonian Period. So before we get into exactly the science behind what this title means and what will be covered in the field trip, can you just tell us why did you decide to organize this field trip?
The easy answer is we didn't. It was one of our colleagues, Bill Lukens, who was at JMU, who decided he wanted to do the field trip part of it. Chuck and I were brought in, guilt by association. But Chuck and we are running the in-person talks on Friday for a couple of hours to talk about the various aspects of this period in time, to where life is, we have marine environments, we have terrestrial environments, and everything in between, in order to try to figure out or learn more about just how did all of this stuff evolve during the Devonian, during the rise of things like plants and critters that wanted to come out and walk on land. So that's the main emphasis. And then combining that with the field trip, we get to put our faces to the rocks to see the clues that we talk about in these various talks tomorrow.
So before we get into the details of the trip and the title again, can we just define what is the Devonian, when was that period, and why is it significant?
Hi, the Devonian period, there's so many aspects to it. One of the biggest ones is that is the first time that life really begins to colonize the surface of the earth on land, to move out of the water and move on to land, which had so many ramifications for the future and the way things are even today. I mean, just one little example. At the beginning of the Devonian, your tallest plants, this is about 420 million years ago, you had plants that were no taller than the stretch of between the far end of your finger, index finger, and the far end of your thumb. And yet by half the way through these 60 million years of time, trees had evolved, all the various structures that they needed to actually stand on the earth, to take nutrition out of the soils, to grow, to take in the CO2 and emit what in the long ago past of Earth was a very toxic, deadly pollutant, oxygen.
Wow, that is so cool. Okay, well, going back to the title of this field trip, Exploring the Catskill Clastic Wedge of West Virginia, can you just explain for the audience, what is a clastic wedge and why is this particular one significant?
A clastic wedge, simply put, is just a buildup of material as it's being shed off of the mountain front that was being created at this time by collision of various tectonic plates. We call it the Acadian orogeny. And as this material kept building outward, I'll just say to the west today, even though our paleogeography was a bit different back then, This material kept being shed off and kept building out into the ocean at that time, being carried by rivers. And it's not just the sediments that's being carried by the rivers, it's also remains of any plants that might have fallen into the rivers, the remains of any other aquatic life that might have been there, and also carried on down the rivers. And what's so important about this is this wedge grows through time. Over this period of the Devonian for 60 million years of time. And so during the 60 million years of time of evolution of terrestrial ecosystems, you're building out in 4 dimensions. Sure, the 3 dimensions of length, width, height, but through time, how are these things changing? When are these things changing? And where are these things changing on this wedge of material that's interacting with this ocean to the west?
Wow.
So we need to understand all 4 aspects, the 4 dimensions of this wedge. And that's why this wedge is so important, because the Devonian sees a lot of changes in terrestrial ecosystems.
Wow. That is so cool how you explain that with the 4th dimension of time. Okay, so you mentioned how the Devonian was this amazing time of transitions of life, like animal life to land, tree life onto, huge trees from tiny, tiny plants. So on this field trip, do we get to see any of these transitions in the rocks?
We're going to start off in an area that represents sometimes marine, sometimes terrestrial and land-based, and they're going to interfinger. And then as we move on up through geological time, closer to the present, but never at the present, we're going to go through a lot of geological time, and we're going to see different rock units that were deposited as we become fully terrestrial.
Wow.
No more seaways are involved. And what we're going to see with this is a change in the type of sediments that are deposited, coastal sediments to terrestrial river-borne sediments to just full-on rivers, no seaways anywhere. And we're going to see how the sediments, how the rock strata change. And the reason they're changing is because the environments are either going to be seaway, coastal, or they're going to be river. And the way sediments interact in these different systems makes a different motif in the rocks that we see. There's patterns of the sedimentation. And the reason this is very interesting is because think about the recent wildfires we've had out west. What happens after a wildfire when it rains? You lose the sediment, you lose the soils. And so during this time period called the Devonian, with the evolution of plants, with the evolution of rooting structures, we fundamentally change how the planet breaks materials down, how it stores things like carbon, how it changes biogeochemical cycles. And that's why this transition is so important, to see what it's doing in coastal areas all the way up closer to the mountain ranges that existed at that time, so we can understand, again, that 4-dimensional aspect of how the sediments we see now as rock were related to what environments were back in the Devonian.
Oh my gosh, what an amazing time. And you mentioned the soils briefly and how things got broken down, like by things that finally evolved root structures and can break down the rock. And you guys also have a description on the conference website of this field trip where you mentioned the evolution of the critical zone. Could you kind of define what that is and why that's important?
You want to handle this one or should I?
You can.
Okay, all right. The critical zone, as we define it, is any place on the Earth which represents the interaction of the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the geosphere. All of these spheres of influence combine and meet at the Earth's surface. In a simplistic way, we can call them soils. The interaction of all these influences to break down geological material. But the critical zone also extends beneath soils, the water tables, the hydrologic cycle deeper down in the sediments and rock. And so in a modern sense, we can look at critical zones all across any climate sequence we want in the modern. But when you get into the geological past, you have multiple critical zones stacked on top of each other through geological time. And so by studying all of these paleospheres of influence, we can figure out and interpret how climates and environments have changed and evolved over time.
So on this field trip, what kind of fossils might we find that, indicate these things to us?
Yeah. Well, the first and the most familiar to even a 6-year-old is finding fossil shells. A lot of the rocks here in the eastern states in this old sedimentary basin that we call this the Appalachian Basin, there are levels in the rock where you can find all these fossil shells of brachiopods that had 2 shells, like clams and their relatives, but very different group of organisms. Corals, there are coral reefs in a few places at times, but more when you have limestones. As you move into the terrestrial lands, the rocks that were land at that time, you might find some scrappy little pieces of wood that got broken up in the river and stuff and maybe carried downstream a distance.
Wow. The first wood in the world.
Yeah, right. The first wood in the world, probably about 400 million years ago.
So this right here is
that's wood. Yeah, see, you can
ancient
move
wood.
This way is like an ancient log jam. You see where it's black?
Yeah.
That's wood.
Oh, cool.
Wood.
Yes, but Evan was able to get it to make little marks on the paper.
So charcoal.
All right, so the plants that we were finding in these oxidized beds here are actually, when you rub them, they have black stuff rubs off on your fingers, meaning that it's charcoal, meaning that they were from a wildfire. And I always get asked, is there evidence of fires in the rock record, of past wildfires? And yes, we have charcoal in the rock record that shows us about past wildfires. And these were from the Devonian, meaning they were some of the earliest wildfires ever on Earth that at least involved trees. So yeah, some of the earliest wildfires. Just so crazy.
Certainly down here in Virginia, West Virginia, in the rocks that were deposited on land, you'll find just scrappy pieces of plant material usually. However, there are exceptional sites where the preservation is exceptional and you can really see the fine detail of some of these fossil plants. It's rare to find that kind of stuff, but there are places where you will find where the roots penetrated down into Dennis's paleosols. You will find places where you have the impressions of the roots on the surface. Maybe here in Virginia, West Virginia, but that haven't been found yet. Basically an imprint of the fossil forest floor. So that's kind of a simplistic view of that.
Wow.
Sometimes there are rocks you don't find any fossils in. So we have to look for other indicators.
That was my next question.
That tell us.
If there's not fossils, do the rocks still tell this story? Like I know you mentioned paleosols.
Yeah.
Can you maybe explain how the rocks give these indications of these changes as well?
Yeah, we both can do a little of this.
Okay.
So for me, if I'm in the marine, you'll find layers that are pretty continuous usually. On land, they're not usually so horizontal and continuous.
Right.
If it's a river channel, you're going to have, at the base of a river channel, it might have eroded down into some of Dennis's fossil soils, paleosols, and on an erosion surface. And so then you get these layers that are dipping sometimes and stuff that are related to the sands, the sediments being carried down. So there's many indicators that geologists and paleontologists use to figure out what was the environment like without having fossils. Dennis, tell us a little more.
Some of the things we look at are the types of sediments. Like limestones, for example, tend to be oceanic. Sandstones with associated mudstones and claystones tend to be more terrestrial or land-based. But even within them, we can go to, for example, coastal environments. And if the rock layers are sitting just right on the side of a mountain, we can have entire exposed beds of ripples and dunes, which tell us paleo flow directions. Maybe there's tidal influence. We can actually see that in the rock record. And so if you don't have the fossils, the environments that formed or deposited the sediments leave telltale clues in the forms of sedimentary structures.
This is a sandstone body.
that's really thick here
Yeah.
and pinches down, completely pinches out, and is surrounded by shale. We don't expect laterally continuous beds to do that, and so why did this pinch out? This is a storm deposit, and because this is falling out, I can show it to you. This is a beautiful example of a hummocky cross-stratified sand, where we get our parallel laminated sands, and then gently dipping 4 sets on the side, and on the other side they'll gently dip as well.
Yeah.
This forms from just a bizarre combination of flow conditions that occur during hurricanes, where there's water that's moving asymmetrically in one direction just a little bit, but also it's wave action, so we get our oscillation cones stirring up the base of the seafloor as well. It's called combined flow. It's a bizarre little sequence, and that stirs up the sand.
Yeah.
We expect these to be out on the continental shelf, so we would say, oh, okay, this might be out somewhere below fair weather wave base. It's pretty deep water. However, there are other deposits just below us and some just above us. Let's look at the ones just above us. Sandy bits surrounded by shale. Sandy bits surrounded by shale.
Yeah.
Some of these in this interval are actually flacer and wavy bedding,
Okay.
which we
It's
get
like tidal?
tidal. So some of these sand bodies actually are probably tidal sandbars.
Wow.
And so they're in the between sandbar intervals
Yeah.
are the tidally influenced flacer wavy bedding. And every once in a while we get a perfect little hummock that's preserved from a storm.
Storm. Wow.
Probably shallower water than one would expect at first.
So, did the development of trees and soils during this time, or any of the other transitions that were going on, heavily affect like global climate at all?
In the Devonian, when we see the explosion of vascularization of roots, of plants, think of like a modern day tree or any kind of plant. We're sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, photosynthesis, we build biomass, we release oxygen, and then in the geological record, as we did more and more of this biomass accumulation, more transfer of oxygen out, CO2 in, globally we change climates and we cascade into an ice age. And so the evolution of vascularization, the evolution of plants taking over landscapes, gave Mother Nature a way to store carbon, which then changed atmospheric dynamics. And we actually went from a hothouse condition into an icehouse condition towards the end of the Devonian. And we see this happening several times in the geological record. And also there are other periods of time to where certain types of plants have evolved that didn't always exist. 15 to 16 million years ago, grasses show up, they take over the world, and it's another way to store carbon in these organic, very fertile prairie soils. And so one could actually argue, and I'm gonna, that the evolution of different types of soils and their associated ecosystems actually drove the evolution of the planet and associated life.
Wow, so important. People don't think about that, but it's so true. Life has affected climates and vice versa in this cycle of one thing affecting another. It's just a positive feedback. It's so cool.
Because we didn't always have oxygen on the planet. It used to be a poison.
Yeah.
Now we kind of like it. We didn't.
I would say so, yeah.
I mean, you think about horses today, or other animals that live on, say, the Serengeti or Great Plains. They have teeth designed for grinding the grasses. These really tall teeth we call hypsodont teeth. 40, 50 million years ago, there weren't a lot of those because they didn't need them. The ecosystems weren't there. And so the co-evolution of mammals and other faunal aspects versus the soils and the floral, they're commingled.
I just did a video on the evolution of grasslands. I was covering a paper that was recently published in Geoscience. That is so funny. What a great follow-up to that. Because it did. It affected the molar. It was like the herbivore turnover, and those that had the long molar teeth were favored. That is, oh my God, just so cool.
An even more drastic change that had to happen at an earlier time was plants evolved from the type of algae or pondweed that lived in shallow water. It took in the sunlight and CO2 from the waters and then put out the oxygen. However, to move onto land, the plants had to develop some kind of external, not skin, but some external covering so that all the water didn't just evaporate out. Because when you're under the water, then the water can just flow in and out and you get your nutrients, you can get all the stuff you need. They also had to develop, and I will use this word truly, they had to develop technologies to be able to stand up on land. And not only that, they couldn't absorb what they needed from the waters anymore, so they had to build a system that would deliver the nutrition they got from the sunlight, photosynthesis, down into the roots, and from the roots they had to draw the nutrients that would be in the soils in order to survive on land. And animals had to go through their own set of changes to adapt from water onto land.
That's just so cool. But speaking of the importance of the critical zone, oh my God. Okay, so can you give us an idea of the trip itinerary, what we're going to see on this field trip?
Sure. We're going to start off in areas which are dominated by seaway environments. We're going to look at some of the strata associated with, I'll just call it the near shore to shallow coastal systems. We're going to see how they interact, how they play back and forth based upon the sediments, and hopefully also we'll find some pretty cool fossils, at least some root traces.
You see this kind of yellow-greenish area? That is a yellowish-greenish mud or shale interbedded with some sands. You've got this thick sand bed here. Then we see slightly more red. We see some red, what looks like mud. I'll explain later. We see some reddish sandstones. Then we're back to green. Greenish grayish blue, more sand or more shales, thinner sands, and they look different than this red area in between, but they look similar to over here.
What happened? Well, we went from marine deposition over here to terrestrial to marine again. How? How do we see these different types of environments in one area? Sea level changes. We have first some high sea level marine sediments over here, and then sea level fell, and we get some terrestrial sediments here, or rather terrestrial marine transition sediments. We can actually see some ripples in the deltaic sandstone beds here, which overlie paleosols, or ancient soils, so going back to fully terrestrial right here. Then we get back to more marine sediments over here with shales and sands interbedded. These sand beds actually have some hummocky cross stratification in them, indicating storm deposition. And the green just indicates deposition in less oxidized conditions. So the oxidized iron-containing rocks are typically more red, and then the more reduced you get, the more green and less red they are. Reduced just means less oxygen was present in the deeper ocean basin where they were deposited. And so then the question is why? Why is sea level changing at this time? Well, what time are we in? Remember, we're in the Devonian. And in the late Devonian, we see sea level changes due to glacial cycles. So at this time, remember, trees just evolved, like Chuck and Dennis were just mentioning. And when we see big trees with big root systems evolve for the first time on Earth, we get the first ever soils on Earth. Just like we saw with the Paleosol sections over there, the ancient soils and those rocks over there. Those were some of the first soils forming on Earth. And what are trees and soils really good at? Taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And when the trees and soils evolved to do that, that caused a major decrease in greenhouse gases and thus a major cooling event. And this cooling caused an ice age, which had glacial cycles that led to sea level fall and rise as glaciers expanded and retreated, which caused our marine and terrestrial cycles in these rocks right here. How cool is that?
Having a blast so far on this field trip. We've got some people back over there. We've got more people up here looking at some sections over here, which I'm headed to now. But yeah, oh my gosh, I'd never been on a GSA field trip before. This is my first time doing one. I'd actually never been to a sectional meeting before.
This is my first sectional meeting. I normally go to the national one, but so far it's so tight-knit, so amazing, so fun. Everybody kind of knows each other by the end because, you know, or by the beginning, because it's so much smaller than the national meeting, and you continue to see each other over and over again. So it's super fun, and the field trip so far is great. There's obviously field trip leaders, the people that know a lot about the rocks and kind of lead the stops and take us to these places. But it's also really cool because, like, it's pretty small, the field trips. We have 18 people in ours. And what's cool about it is that everybody has their own expertise and they kind of bring that with them to the rocks. And now we have like all these new perspectives on like what we're seeing, maybe some of the fossils, plant fossil people versus vertebrate fossil people, which is super cool, marine rock people versus terrestrial rock people, or me, the geochemist that looks at the colors and the oxidation and reduction. So it's super cool to have all these different perspectives and an amazing outcrop, or many amazing outcrops that we can all look at and try and interpret together and see if we find anything new.
We will then move more on land, and we will see the full-on ancient river systems and floodplains that we're developing at this time, showing channels here, floodplains over there, and within the floodplain specifically, we'll look at more ancient soil-forming evidence to see, you know, how it's changing the landscape.
Each of these little benches that are exposed are paleosols, like the vertical faces. And what's nice about this is right on top of the soil surfaces, we get these crevasse clay sands. So, I mean, it is just, if you took a pencil on the outcrop and delineated, there's the top of the soil, gentle enough fluvial deposition on the floodplain to actually preserve the top of the paleosol. So I'll take this moment to proselytize the new wave of paleopedology. My good colleague Gary Stinchcombe and I have been scouring the rock record anywhere we were looking at paleosols, trying to keep an open mind. The tops of soils don't always have to be eroded. There are cases where there's gentle enough burial where the A horizon, the surface horizon, it's not the organic layer, but the uppermost mineral soil likely does get preserved. And I think it was a more conservative dogma for a while that we just assumed all paleosols were decapitated. But the more we look for it, the more we're seeing cases like we have a very thin little fluvial sand on top. It's just a flood deposit. I don't think that had enough energy to erode out a clay-rich, 10 centimeter interval. Another thing to note on, there's variations in the erosional resistance as you go up the outcrop. In this lower one, you see those like black knobbly bits. Those are calcareous nodules. And so this is one of those cases where there are carbonate nodules in the soil. We don't see them at all in New Hampshire here. And that requires dewatering of the soil. You can get in a lot of different kind of geochemical combinations. But right here, this is to impress upon you, for a long time, the only way we knew what CO2 levels were in the Paleozoic was from a proxy system that used those kinds of nodules in paleosols. Now we have a whole army of different CO2 proxies, but unless you have beautifully mummified liverworts, or you have amazing leaf fossils with cuticle, these are very rare. You're not getting CO2 in the Paleozoic. But what are very common in the rock record are paleosols. And when there's carbonates, you can play around with what was atmospheric CO2.
Yeah, cool.
What's the green?
Those are drab reduced iron zones. We typically see those in paleosols in association with organic matter that decayed away. And you can see, if you look across the outcrop, see a whole bunch of them kind of streaming down. Yeah. And they're all coming down from this zone up in here. Yeah. Now, where would the most organic matter be in a soil profile? At the top, where there's a higher concentration of humus and roots. And there's a decrease in the concentration and abundance spatially of roots down profile. In a paleosol, anytime you have that organic material, that is food for microbes. So if you bury this below the water table and there's no freely mixing oxygen, the microbes are aerobic bacteria. They consume locally all of the oxygen and will reduce the iron. And so you get this depletion halo around the organics.
Wow.
It's not the only way to make it, but that's what we see in this kind of case.
So cool. Gotta get some acid in the video.
Okay, so I powdered here. That wasn't powdered. So that's just carbonate.
Okay.
Readily fizzed, not on the powder. Okay, so why is it orangey yellow? What other minerals do we know are just orangey yellow?
Iron oxides?
Iron oxides and iron hydroxides. So hematite and goethite. These are very common soil form minerals as well. And they can form their own concretions in soils, typically in the wetter part of the year. So if you have a paleosol that has diachronously really wet intervals, really dry intervals, you can get combinations of carbonate and goethite. You can see it in section.
Wow. Like concretions of it within the nodule?
Just wrapped around like onion skin.
Cool.
You can even see carbonates form in the dewatering dry portion of the year. You can see coatings of clay around them from when it was wetter and there were rain events percolating clay during the wetter season.
Wow.
Wrapped around like onion skin. And sometimes the clays and the irons are just so intertangled, it's like this orangey, clayey thing, and it's just both.
So these huge soil profiles that are back here that we just looked through, all these shelves of soil profiles, ancient soil, paleosol profiles. These are some of the earliest soils on Earth. I mean, we were talking about, there was a question, what were the first soils on Earth? What were the earliest soils on Earth? And it kind of comes down to this question of, okay, how do you define soil? And there are some weathered surfaces preserved from the Precambrian over 500 million years ago, long before the Devonian and the Mississippian, which are the rocks that we're in. But they're not thick, soil profiles that we know today. If you want to see thick soil profiles, the first examples you have are from the Devonian, because you had trees evolve that have root systems that get down into the ground, into the rock, break it up, and form soils. So, depends how you define soil, but first very thick soil profiles are from the Devonian. And right now we're in Mississippi, lower Mississippian rocks, so right after the Devonian period. But these are some of the earliest soils on Earth. So super cool. There's a beautiful view of them. We've gone from soils now to these rocks. I see some cross beds here. Wonder what this could be. Let's go see what they say. All right, so I found out that we've got soils. We've got the soils that were over there, kind of behind the sandstone bed here. And in between all these beautiful sandstones with the cross bedding I just showed earlier, these are fluvial channels that came through, so river channels that came through and cut across these soils that were there. And that occurred in a high enough energy system to form the cross beds. Okay, we're getting called back because we're running behind schedule. Well, we're kind of behind schedule. We're all too into rocks. This is just so cool. I always say geology is not just rocks, and it isn't. There's a lot that is geology. It's all of Earth. It's the study of Earth. Geo means Earth. And that includes all of Earth's processes, environments. But I also think just rocks is a horrible, horrible phrase. Because what do you mean just rocks? Rocks are so cool. They hold so much information, and not just their structures or their fossils, but their chemistry, their context, and their time. I mean, anyway, rocks are amazing, underappreciated, and here we go, next stop.
But intermixed with this, because geology doesn't always give us the rock strata in the order we want to see them, we will have other stops which are going to take us completely back into the marine, into the deepest parts of the basin, to show us something that are called turbidites, which are basically underwater sediment flows, underwater landslides that are running out over long distances and settling out on a deep ocean floor. And then we are going to see something which is equivalent to what we refer to as the Marcellus Shale, the thing which was the focus of the big natural gas boom around here over the past decade or two. And that's going to be interspersed in with this general transition from being close to a coastline, moving on up onto the wedge and seeing how the rocks and the sediments change.
We're in the shale now. We are in the finest and the darkest of the shale here, indicating the deepest part of this basin marine environment, meaning also that this was relatively anoxic or potentially low in oxygen concentrations in that marine environment condition, and that led to less or smaller fossils being preserved here because there was less oxygen, and animals require oxygen, even in the ocean. We're seeing where there's coarser sands and even fine layers of sands in some of these shales. This means there was definitely some shallower influence here, and maybe some oxygenation events that brought oxygen down to the deeper parts and allowed more animals to live there, and maybe some more fossils. What we're seeing here are very small brachiopods. I'll try to get some video of them or images if we find any. All right, just pulled this off of there, and we got tiny, oh, there it is, tiny brachiopod. Look at the ridges. Crazy. Apparently also some of these other little polka dots are, oh yeah, I can see the ridges on those. Some baby brachiopods. They're not babies. They're just a certain type of species that apparently is really small to handle the poorly oxygenated conditions of the deeper parts of the ocean. How crazy is that? So here we have a volcanic ash layer, that thin tan layer that was volcanic ash from a nearby or potentially kind of far away eruption from this marine basin that deposited ash in this calm, mudstone depositing environment. And then because you're in a marine basin, it got altered to clay and then preserved in this layer. And then if you move up, they were talking about how this is so thin and there's no burrows in it that it was likely very anoxic of an environment. See how thin and dark it is up here. Typically the darker it is, the less oxygen was available and the more organic matter burial you have because it wasn't getting decomposed. And the reason finding volcanic ash in these sedimentary rocks is so important is because we can date the ash very precisely using isotopic dating, which can help us pinpoint the ages of these shale beds. Okay, so we've moved up section to here. Well, we've driven from where we were. We're up section, so we're a little bit shallower now. And so we're still seeing shales, but lots more sand. You can see the sand. Lots of turbidite sequences in here. And so that just means sequences where coarser stuff has flowed down into the basin, the deeper part of the basin, and you get fans, kind of like alluvial fans on land, but in the ocean, in ocean basins. So you get these sequences of coarser grain stuff followed by finer grain stuff where you have all the sand and coarser stuff fall down. Then you have, as the plume of stuff settles down, of finer grain stuff suspended in the water column settles down on top of that, you get this normal graded sequence of coarser grained sand followed by or with finer grained muds and shales on top of it. And because this is a lot of turbidite sequences, there's a lot more sedimentary structures like ripples and crossbeds, which is pretty cool. What I love about this trip is that you can clearly see where people's interests lie. We've got people way down there looking at the sedimentary structures like ripple marks, which are super cool, and turbidite sequences, which are super cool structurally in terms of rocks, and talk about or tell us about the sedimentary processes that went on, the depositional environment that it was deposited in. And then you have people over here looking for fossils and burrows, which are clearly more, paleontological interested people. And then, you have the people that maybe aren't even interested in this because they care more about the terrestrial systems anyway, or the paleosols, like Dennis maybe. Sorry, I'm calling out you, Dennis. But anyway, yeah, and maybe I'm not alone in this, but I am interested in it all. I love it all. It's so cool. I used to think paleosols and soils were boring, but then I learned more about them. I feel like everything I used to think is boring, I learn more about, and then I think it's super cool. So, just learn about things. Come on these field trips, and you'll find that all of this stuff is super cool.
And then there's one or two other stops which may get thrown in, which are just, ooh, and that's it. But if there's any field trip that's worth its salt, any planned stop usually diverges into 5 or 10 different conversations. And so while I've provided the general itinerary, depending upon level of interest, who knows? We might make it into the first 3 stops and have to turn on the headlights and just start looking at rocks at night. So, with the general theme, marine into terrestrial is the idea.
All right, we're here at stop 5, and you can see this beautiful view in the background here, this overlook of the Appalachians. But as geologists, we're less interested in overlooks, more interested in outcrops. Well, one of the indicators that this area is a paleosol, an ancient soil, are these shiny kind of squiggly lines. You can see them all throughout here. Oh, here's one. There's beautiful ones. Those are root traces. This is a filled root trace. How crazy is that? And then these paleosols are cut in by river channels. Way coarse grained sandstones. Thick layers of sandstone. I'll back up so you can see. The coarser grained sandstones are from fluvial deposits, river deposits, and then we've got soils in between. So cool. And some of these rocks you can see these sparkly bits, which you can't see it too well in that rock, but if you were here, I swear you could see them shimmer in the sunlight. If you can't see it on camera, you're gonna have to take my word for it. But these sparkly bits are little mica flakes, and mica formed in these due to the alteration of clay during low-grade metamorphism, which just means that these rocks, when they were uplifted and during tectonics and put under high heat and pressure during this alteration, some of that clay in there in the paleosols became metamorphosed, at least at a low grade. So, not super crazy metamorphism. So we can still see a lot of the structures preserved, but a lot of them have been altered, which is why it is a source of frustration for some people, like maybe Dennis, who wants to study the original structures of the soil. And funny thing I've noticed about the Appalachians is that if you ask the southeastern section people how to pronounce it, they do say Appalachian. But if you ask the northeastern section people, or those GSA members that are from the northeastern section or within the northeastern section, they say Appalachian. So I don't know, man. Comment down below what you think this mountain range is pronounced.
And this is a question for both of you, so both of you can answer. What is your favorite part about this trip, or what are your favorite rocks in this complex of rocks?
For me, it's a complex question because I've worked in the marine for a long time.
Yeah.
And then in about 2010, 2011, I decided, because I lived fairly close, about an 8-minute drive to the closest Devonian terrestrial rocks in western Albany County, New York.
Did they convert you?
And the Catskills were there, which I learned to love when I first came out to the east as a young musician. And I decided, I live within an easy drive of a lot of the real classic Devonian terrestrial in the Catskill Mountains. And I had said before I even took my job back in 1999 that I wanted to draw some lines of correlation, same age lines, from the terrestrial into the marine into the terrestrial, which has been hard to do. So that's part of my big interest. And we're going to see those extremes, starting with that basinal, deeper water, seaway, black shales, and going all the way up to where you're onto land.
So all of it. Yeah, all of it's your favorite.
All of it.
I mean, that's valid. That's awesome.
Dennis.
My focus is the terrestrial. So give me the ancient rivers, give me the ancient floodplains.
I got that vibe, yeah.
Give me where the marine and the terrestrial interfinger so we can see how sea levels are going up and down.
Yeah.
I have some ancient soil profiles that have, I'll just call them seashells, on top of them when the ocean level rose and seashells were deposited on top of my beautiful ancient soils. I know why I'm fascinated, and it all started back when I was in grad school, and I was working out in the western part of the United States in Badlands National Park. And one of the rangers out there, when I was working for the Park Service, said, "What are those weird stripes out there on the rock?" And I went, "I'll find out." And then come to find out, they were ancient land surfaces. They were showing changes through time from hot conditions to cooler conditions, forested to more grassy open. And that love of looking at ancient ecosystems has just translated through all of my research, now also into the Devonian, at another critical point in Earth history, to where we're changing from forested to then going into a cooler period with an ice age. And so the rocks, they're just nature's way of recording all this. And that's why I focus more on the terrestrial aspect.
Speaking of ancient climates and periods of ancient major transitions in life in Earth's history, why is it important that we study ancient Earth?
For me, I consider myself a detective, and I am a detective that's looking at history, deep time history, the history of the Earth and the history of life on the Earth. And just one of the things that fascinated me in my mid to late 20s when I got into geology so much was just, for one thing, thinking about time in the sense that we do as geologists, which is to say nothing about astronomers.
Right.
Right. But anyway, that and also being able to just get in my car. I'd come across a book in the local library about the local geology from the New York State Museum, and I could get in my car and I could go look. And so just by character, I have always been very much a naturalist, and the geology really fulfilled that at such a huge scale. Thinking about the world 400 million years ago in the eastern U.S., and thinking about different smaller continents colliding with the eastern coast, which, as Dennis said, wasn't east at that time. It was a little more towards the southeast, and we were south of the equator, but north of 30 degrees south, which you can read from the volcanic ash layers in the rock, that the wind directions south between 0 and 30 degrees, and we were probably closer to 30 degrees than otherwise, that the ashes got blown towards the west, just like it does in the tropics between 0 and 30 south nowadays.
Oh, that's so cool.
All these things that you can learn to read to reconstruct this ancient history, and this ancient history in which Homo sapiens is such a small bit of it. Yeah.
I would echo everything that Chuck said, but I spin it just slightly differently, and I relate a lot of this to my time when I was working for the Park Service. I was an interpreter for the National Park Service, and my job was to explain the rocks. And so, this is going to sound corny, I view myself almost as an ambassador to geologic history, because you have people coming through national parks who want to know what's going on, and layers of strata are like pages in a book.
Yes.
The words are written in the sediments, the words are written in the fossils, and if you can learn how to read the rocks, you can read the history of the planet. And the reason I think this is so important is because we are so concerned about where our planet is headed now with climate and environment. We see the changes. One of the things we can do is go into the geological archive of Earth history to see where we've been before any humans were around to mess things up, to hopefully inform us about where we might be going.
Yes.
So that, I think, is
Both of
that's
those
what I
answers
enjoy
so
the most.
Beautifully said. Oh my gosh, that really gets it across. That was really wonderful. Thank you.
And plus, it's a lot of fun just to talk about rocks.
That's the side bit.
Yes.
Yeah, we all love it. Okay, last couple questions. One, what is, if anything, what is the most important thing or best thing you hope that people take out of this field trip, the people that are attending the field trip? What do you want them to get out of it?
I want them to hopefully see or appreciate what it is that Chuck and I see in the rocks, our interpretations, so they can take them back to their particular aspects or fields or specialties, if it's within the Devonian or if it's within some other part of geological time, some other area, to take the ideas and concepts that we're presenting so that they can apply them into their own research and their own interpretations. Because, as one person said in a talk I heard today, we don't do this science in a vacuum. It's a team sport. And the more faces, ideas we have on any particular rock exposure, the better it is, because, like I said, even if we're at 1 or 2 field trip stops out of 6 or 7, it's because we're having good discussions. We're figuring things out.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, we always come away with a better understanding of what's going on. But this is going to sound odd. If it works well, by the time we're done, we're also going to realize that we knew less than we did when we started the field trip, because so many other things have now come into focus for us that we must now incorporate.
Okay, very last question. If there's any students listening to this, what would be your advice to students in geoscience, whether it be on attending field trips or attending conferences or just navigating geoscience and going to university and studying geoscience in general? What's your advice to the students today?
1, go to meetings for networking. I've talked to several students today after my talk, and I said you need to consider X, Y, and Z for that type of stuff that you want to study. But the one thing which, and maybe this is flavored more by my own experience and what I study, but interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary classes, topics, that's really what it's all about. I mean, we could, 20, 30 years ago, geology, rocks, we are our own thing. But as we've learned more and more, we need the biology, we need the chemistry, we need the physics, we need the astronomy. And we are really a science that incorporates all aspects of all other sciences.
Yes.
And so going forward and preparing oneself for the next phase of what I would just call the geosciences, it's become even more interdisciplinary, even over the past couple of decades that I've been a professor, seeing these new technologies always coming in and giving us new ways to treat data. And then as far as any kind of student who might be considering grad school, when you come to the meetings, talk to the people who've given the presentations. Do not fear that white tower of academia. Go up, because almost every professor that I know loves to talk about what they're doing. And so, don't be shy. Send that email. Go to that meeting. Listen to that talk.
Much of what I'd say would be like Dennis would say. I would say, yes, go to meetings. Go and take a variety of classes. But also, and this struck me very much at this meeting already, is the more you have experience in, the more rocks you've seen and learned to look at and read things out of, and also with the chemistry of it too. What patterns are in the rocks, in a succession of rocks, that tell you more about the conditions, how much oxygen was in the environment, how little was, what nutrition's like. You know, there's so many things. The more you see, the more you experience, the better you are at interpreting what you're seeing, and also improving what you're seeing better, so you can go even deeper into very subtle things that you wouldn't pick up on until you've been through it some.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you both so much for
you,
this. I love that you mentioned the interdisciplinary aspect of things, looking at the chemistry, looking at the physical features, looking like combining these sciences is so important these days, and that's just becoming necessary in all these fields. So just very important words, encouragement for students. So thank you. And thank you for the whole interview. This is so cool. I can't wait for the field trip.